Harry Reid's in a lot of trouble. Harry Reid said something he apparently should not have said, and we're going to judge whether he's guilty or not. Oh, come on, that's fun. Okay, first off, it comes from a book that Mark Halperin has written about his experience in the 2008 campaign. He wrote it with John Heilemann. It's called Game Change. And apparently Harry Reid said in a private conversation that he was wowed by Obama's oratorical gifts. Okay, that's no problem at all. That sounds good. Then he said that he might be helped by the fact that he's a, quote, light-skinned African-American, and here comes the really bad part, with no Negro dialect, unless he wanted to have one. All right, now, let's break that down in three different segments. Okay, number one, he's a light-skinned African-American. Well, I guess. He's half white, half black, so in some ways that makes him a light-skinned African-American. Now, is that a racist thing to say? No, he is. Now, does that help him politically? It might, given the context and the history of this country. Now, if that's what Harry Reid is commenting on, well, that's a perfectly normal comment. I have no beef with that at all, right? And if he's saying, hey, you know what, I'm a little bit more comfortable with him because he's a light-skinned African-American as opposed to a dark-skinned African-American, then we would have massive issues, right? But he didn't say that. Okay, so anyone who's telling you that he implied that, that's just not at all in what he said. So that's point number one. That's not that much trouble. Then you go to the Negro dialect. It's a hell of a funny way of saying it, And so number one, does Harry Reid think, you know what? Oh, these Negroes and their dialect. I don't know. It's hard to tell. I imagine not, given the history of Harry Reid and how he's voted and how he's acted, which is very important. Context is important. It seems more to me that he's old school. Some older folks, they just grew up in a different time when you would say Negro or colored guy, and people would go around. And if you listen to old Martin Luther King speeches, he says Negro all the time. He says colored man all the time. In fact, of course, the NAACP, the CP stands for colored people. So, old school, is it not advisable to put it that way? Come on, Harry, you got to know better than that. That's crazy. What are you saying Negro dialect for in the year 2008? That's nuts. Okay, so of course that's going to cause some trouble. I think the third part of it, actually, that people aren't talking about enough, might be the most problematic part. Unless he wanted to have one. He has no Negro dialect unless he wanted to have one. That implies that he thinks Obama's a little fake. That, he doesn't have an accent or a dialect, but that if he was somewhere where he needed to have one, all of a sudden he would have one. Okay, I mean, maybe you just call that a politician, right? And we've seen different politicians, including Obama, when they go in the South, they have a little bit more of a Southern dialect. And we'll put it politely like that, not in the words that Harry Reid would use, whether it's for black people or white people or whatever it might be, right? So I think that is maybe his worst insult to Obama in that whole sentence. Now, some people say, okay, but you guys are being unfair here. If this was a conservative who said it, you'd have ripped his head off. That's fairly true. So let's see if that's fair or unfair, right? Number one, by the way, I don't want anybody to be mistaken. I think it's a dumb thing for Harry Reid to say, because you got to know better in the year 2008 to put it that way, even if you think that, okay? Even if you're making a political comment and you're not making a comment about, oh, well, I don't like the Negro dialect, or I don't, or I like that he's light-skinned African-American. I don't care. You don't put it that way. That's dumb. And number two, it'll cause political damage. We'll get back to that in a little bit, okay? But now, why would we treat conservatives and Democrats a little differently here? Now, that's when Republicans and conservatives lose it. You see that? You're hypocrites and you're double-standard. But listen, so much of statements are in their context and are in their inferences and implications, right? So if someone who's voted against civil rights legislation, voted against any legislation that appears to help African Americans throughout their whole career, starts talking about Negroes, well, then you come at it from a little different perspective. Hey, you know what? I wonder why he voted against those things. Maybe he's got a legitimate beef with affirmative action, as I do, and he thinks maybe it hurts minorities. But once he starts talking about Negro this and Negro that, you begin to question. Now, is that fair or unfair? I think it's perfectly fair. We live in a world full of context, and we try to divine why people voted the way they did and what leads to their actions, etc., or said the things that they said. Now, if somebody's voted to help African Americans and acted to help African Americans their whole life. That doesn't mean they can't be racist. Doesn't mean they don't have some old school thoughts. And maybe Harry Reid has some of those things. But does it mean that you give him maybe the benefit of the doubt as to whether he meant to be racist when he's never acted racist? Well, I think that's a fair conclusion. Now, look, if you think it's an unfair conclusion, I understand. If you want to let Harry Reid have it, let him have it. And I'm no big friend of Harry Reid, you know from doing this show. He's not my favorite guy in the world, right? But if you ask me about this specific comment, I think it's dumb, but I don't think it's racist. Okay. Now, as far as we can tell, by the way, I'm open to being proven otherwise if you show me other comments or other actions by Harry Reid, because as I said a million times, it's about the context. Now, the political damage. Oh, he's in a lot of trouble, man. You know, like I told you, that Mark Halpern book has a million damaging stories about so many different politicians, including John Edwards and Joe Biden and Sarah Palin, et cetera, et cetera. The only one anybody's talking about at this point is Harry Reid. Why? Of course, the right-wing media in this country is so strong. So the minute they picked up on that, they went ballistic on it. Fox News, Rush Limbaugh, all the conservative talk shows on a 24/7 loop. Harry Reid's racist, Harry Reid's racist, Harry Reid's racist, et cetera, et cetera. So now that's all anybody's talking about. And Harry Reid had terrible numbers for his re-election campaign in Nevada to begin with. Now you're going to add this controversy on top of it? Man, it does not look good. That's a tough blow for a guy who was already, politically speaking, if you believe the polls, it looked like on his last legs. This might be a straw that camel's back can't take. So, look, it might cost him with his progressive supporters if they believe that, you know, he meant it in a bad way. And if they don't show up to vote or they go to vote against him, oh, he's in a world of trouble. And it might cost him even more with independents. Not Republicans who are going to vote against him in Nevada anyway. But independents are critical here, and it might do even more damage there. And look, whether what he said is bad or not, perception matters a lot in politics. And if the perception is that there's two problems here. One, if they perceive him as racist, obviously that's a huge problem. Number two, if they perceive him as a bad politician, weak, and always failing or having to respond to controversies. Now, these controversies, whether they're right or they're wrong, they add up in political terms. And you got to understand that reality. So at the end of the day, Harry Reid, because of this, has really stepped in it, and he's got to perform some sort of magic trick to be able to get reelected in Nevada. I think he's in a world of hurt.